my dear friends, as some of you know, from the time, or up until the time I was about 13, I lived in Baraboo, Wisconsin, a little bit north of here. And at that time, I was happy. I was content with my life. I had my friends, I had my school, I had my church, I had my sports teams. I was happy. But one day, my dad and my mom gathered me and my four younger siblings together and told us that we were going to move to the Madison area. That meant a new school, a new church, new friends, new home, new everything. And I was despondent. I didn't like that. And without really thinking about it, I remember just blurting out, "That's not fair! You can't do that!" And then my dad quietly smiled and said, "Oh, Sam, I didn't know that we needed your approval to make family decisions." And then he went to the kitchen and came back and said, "Sam, I have the family budget right here. Do you want to maybe look at it and give us your permission before we go through with that?" And then he said, "Hey, I have this car payment that I have to make for the Honda. Do you want to approve it? I was going to pay it, but I just want permission for it first. Is it okay that I do that?" He got me to shut up. Throughout the next few months, he kind of continued to remind me of my place. I remember he asked all my siblings, "Hey, who wants to go to Pizza Ranch?" And they said, "Oh, yes, I do." And then they said, "Well, first, guys, we need to ask Sam for permission. Sam, we want to go to Pizza Ranch, but is it okay? Do we have your permission? We don't want to do anything without your permission, Sam." And he was right to do that. That was a good thing. I needed to learn my place. And he did it in a humorous, gentle way. But I needed to learn my place. I was the son. He was the father. It wasn't my place to tell him what's right and wrong. It wasn't my place to tell him what's fair and unfair. I, as the son, was supposed to trust him. Trust the father. Trust that the decisions he makes are for the good of the family, even if they don't make sense to me at the time. And here we see something similar in Genesis 18, where God is going to make this decision. But first, he actually asks Abraham for his input. He actually says, "I want Abraham's opinion on this. Abraham, what do you think about this?" And from Abraham's response, we see one of the most beautiful, the greatest prayers in the Bible that shows us exactly what it means to see God as your Father. So there's no theme and parts here. We're just going to walk through the text, and then we'll apply it. So first, the historical context. So this is about 2000 BC. Abraham is what we call the patriarch of the Israelites, God's people. So from him, the whole nation of Israel comes. But we also kind of consider Abraham to be our ancestor, or our father in the faith, because it actually says in Genesis that he was righteous. God considered him righteous and saved because of his faith. And so we share the same faith as Abraham. We kind of consider him our father in the faith and our example in the faith. And so Abraham is living in what is now southern Israel, and Sodom and Gomorrah are in what is now southern Israel. And now that place is where the Dead Sea is, the saltiest body of water in the entire globe. And it's really just this desolate desert. That's you can't even live there. But at this time, 4,000 years ago, it was lush, and you could live there, and there was farms there. And these two cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, were apparently very rich and prosperous and wealthy, but also very oppressive. And God actually says that the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah has come to his ear. Now, that word for outcry is always used in the Old Testament as the cries of the oppressed, the cries of those who are being marginalized. So the women that are being taken advantage of and assaulted and hurt and abused, their cries of terror, their cries of pain actually go up to God's ear. The children that are being abandoned and abused and sacrificed, their cries of pain go up to God's ear. The people who are poor and are being stepped on by the rich and the mighty, their cries of desperation go up to God's ear. God is so loving that he hears the cry of the oppressed, and so he's actually going to come down in the form of a human being and actually see what's going on. But first, he asks Abraham his opinion. He tells Abraham about it, and he says, Abraham, what do you think? Which I think brings us to our first point of application. Prayer is not optional for the Christian. Think about this. What if God, the holy creator of the universe, who is all powerful, came down and said, hey, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think about it? How am I doing? What's your opinion on things? What do you think? I want to hear your opinion. Let me hear it. Anything you got to say. Let me hear it. What do you think? Would you take that opportunity? If God came to you and said, tell me what you think. I don't care how right it is. I don't care how wrong it is. Just let me know what you think. Would you take that opportunity, or would you say, nah, I'm good? Well, that's exactly what God invites you to do. In prayer, that is exactly what God asks you to do. The question isn't, why should I pray? The question really isn't, why on earth would it be? Well, the two reasons why you maybe wouldn't pray is either because you don't quite understand who God is, you don't quite understand how powerful, how merciful, and how good, and how loving He actually is, and so you say, it's probably not really worth my time. Or you don't quite understand yourself. You don't quite understand how desperately dependent you are on God for everything. You've let yourself be convinced that really you're in control of your life. Really, things are under your control. You got it. You don't really need Him. And I've definitely seen it in my life, and maybe you've seen it in yours. The more you realize how desperately dependent you are on God, the more you tend to pray. And the better things are going in your life, and the more you think that you got a handle on things, usually the less you pray. And so sometimes God allows things to enter our lives to remind us, hey, you're really not in control of things, so that we come back to Him and continue to pray. So it destroys our illusion that we're in control of all things. And the more you see how beautiful and how profound a gift prayer actually is, the more you tend to use it. Well, what should we be praying? What should our prayers look like? Well, look to Abraham. So God tells Abraham that what He's going to do, He's probably going to destroy these cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham, notice what he does. He doesn't do what I did with my dad, where I said, hey, I don't think that's fair, therefore that's not fair, and you shouldn't do that. No, Abraham doesn't hold God to his own standard. He holds God to God's standard. It says, God, you are holy. You are righteous. You have revealed yourself to me, someone who rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. And this thing that you're about to do would punish the righteous. Treat the righteous people who love and obey you as if they were evil. What if there are 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom who love you, who cherish you, who obey you, even while their neighbors don't? Are you going to treat them the same as the rest of the evil people? That doesn't seem like you. That doesn't seem right. And God says, yeah, you're right. Correct. That's true. If there are 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I won't destroy it. And this part just brings me to my knees as you think about the mercy and the wisdom of God, the mercy of God, that He values righteousness and goodness and honesty and charity so much that He would be willing to spare an entire city of evil people for the sake of the people that do what He says, but also the wisdom of God that He would push Abraham just far enough to get this wonderful prayer from Abraham. And so He says, yeah, okay, 50 people, I won't destroy it. But then Abraham takes a step further. And he says, okay, now, I don't deserve your ear. I am just dust and ashes. You are the holy God of the universe. I know my place. But you say you're merciful. And so I want to see just how merciful you are. Well, what if there are 45? I mean, 45, 50, that's only 5 people. Would you destroy an entire city for the lack of 5 people? And God says, yeah, you're right. If there's 45 people, I won't destroy the city. And then Abraham knew his limit. He knew when to knock it off. And so that he said, okay, yeah, awesome. Thanks, God. I love it. He went home. Except he didn't. No, he continues to push. And he says, okay, what about 40? And God says, yeah, if there's 40 people, Yeah, I won't destroy it. And then he takes a step further and says, okay, what about 30? And as I'm reading this, I'm getting a little nervous, like, hey, Abraham, stop it. Stop. But God says, okay, 30. I won't destroy it. And then he takes a step further and says, okay, what about 20? Abraham, stop it. That's enough. No, God says, okay, for the sake of 20, I won't destroy it. What about 10? Okay, for the sake of 10, I won't destroy it. Now, be honest. If you were God, would you have lost your patience? Would you have said, hey, okay, knock it off. Stop it. Go away. But God doesn't do it. I would have. God doesn't, because he is infinitely patient. And he loves this prayer from Abraham. I look at Abraham and think, Abraham, do you have any idea what you're talking to? And the point is, actually, Abraham knows exactly who he's talking to, which is why he prays this prayer, and that is why this prayer is the absolutely God-pleasing, perfect prayer. Why? Well, first of all, this prayer is humble, right? Abraham doesn't come to God and say, hey, you listen here, Buster Brown, you do. No, I'm nothing. I am dust and ashes. I don't deserve anything. I don't deserve your ear. I'm only talking to you because you'll let me. Okay, it's humble. At the same time, it's unthinkably bold. Right? God, you have said this about yourself. You have said that you are just, that you are righteous, and that you love people. This doesn't make sense. And I know that you are good and you don't lie, and so therefore I take your word seriously. And this seems to be contradicting your word, which I know is impossible because you don't lie. Actually, Abraham holding God accountable to his word is the ultimate show of faith, because he's saying, I know what your word says, your word is true, and you don't contradict your word because you don't lie. This prayer is persistent. Relying only on God's mercy, knowing that God is merciful and kind, even if he doesn't seem like it. And holding God accountable. You say you're kind, I'm going to see how kind you really are. I know that you're kind, and so I'm going to assume that you're kind and know that even for 10 righteous people, you will destroy all the city. This is not the kind of prayer that you would pray to your boss. You don't talk this way to your boss. You don't talk this way to your master if you're a servant. You don't talk this way to a God that you're trying to impress. You typically don't talk this way to a God who's just a nice guy in the sky and he's not going to do anything to challenge you. No. You tell me, when you see Abraham talking this way, what does it remind you of? Who talks this way to anyone? A child to his father. This is a prayer of a child to his father, and that is what makes Christianity absolutely unique and different from every other religion in the world. You need to understand that. Typically, the Jews and the Muslims, especially the Muslims, would look at us and say that we are blasphemous, scandalous, for calling someone as holy and as righteous and as perfect as God. Bob, who gave you the right to do that? That is unbelievable. You can't do it. And, maybe the Easterners, probably the Hindus and other people who don't see God as a personal being, but more as just this impersonal force, would say, well, you guys are a little naive, thinking that someone as big and as infinite as God would actually hear you and then actually answer you. You people are naive for that. There are some who will say that God is their father. They refer to God as their father. But what they mean by that, it is not necessarily, they mean that God is their creator. That they are God's offspring in the sense that God created them. And we believe that to be true. But that is not what we are saying when we say our Father in heaven. If you will, turn to the Galatians chapter 4 passage in your bulletin. Here Paul tells us exactly what we are saying when we say that God is our Father. First, Adam and Eve. Our first parents, our true mother and father, well, they had a perfect relationship with God in the Garden of Eden. And then when they fell into sin, they destroyed it. And they broke God's holy law. And because the law is perfect, that means that they're imperfect. And the law demands that anyone who breaks it deserves to die, not just here physically, but eternally in the wrath of hell. And yet this says when the time had fully come, God the Father sent God the Son, the holy, perfect Son of God, equal to God in his deity, and he became a human being, born of a woman, born under the law. He actually became obedient to his own law and followed his own law absolutely perfectly, and yet died under the law, died the wrath, and died the death that we should have died on the cross. Why? So that we sinners could receive the full rights of sons and daughters of the King. We are not simply God's offspring. We have the status in God the Father's heart, the same as God the Son, Jesus Christ himself. When God looks at you, he sees the perfection and the glory and the beauty of Jesus himself, and therefore you have the same access to God the Father that Jesus himself. That is who God the Father sees when he looks at you. That is how perfect and beautiful and glorious you are in God's eyes. That is your identity. That is who you are. You are sons and daughters of the King. You used to be slaves. Now you are sons and daughters of the King. You know, really, as I said before, there are two different ways to look at God, to relate to God. There's really two ways. You can relate to God as a slave master, or you can relate to God as your father. You know, if God is your slave master, well, you know, if your slave master punishes you or he gives you something difficult to deal with, you can rightly assume that you're probably being punished for something. That you're doing something wrong and you need to figure it out so that it stops. If God is your slave master, well, a slave master will reward the goodness of his servant. So if good things are happening to you, then you can, you know, rightly assume that you are doing good. And then maybe if other slaves are not doing as well as you and they don't have the blessings that you have, maybe you look down on those slaves and say, hey, you slaves need to be more like me because I'm you know, look at all the good things that are happening to me. But at the same time, if God is your slave master, you know, slave masters aren't known for their unconditional love, right? You need to earn it. And if God is your slave master, you never really know whether he really loves you. Whether you've done enough to earn his favor, you'll never really know. But what if God is your father? What if the Lord God of heaven and earth considers you his child? Well, that means that in the same way that fathers will allow their children to endure difficult things, not because they hate them, not even as a punishment, but to strengthen them and make them strong and mature them. Well, then the hard things in your life are not a punishment. They're not a sign of God's anger or wrath, but simply to strengthen you and to make you more like him, to help you grow. In the same way that a father might have to shove really awful tasting medicine down his child's throat because that child needs it in order to be saved, in order to be healthy. Well, in the same way, sometimes God allows us to experience things that taste really awful, that don't make sense, and we don't understand at the time, but actually this is saving us, and maybe we don't understand it well. In the same way that over time, children learn to trust their parents, trust their fathers. It took me a little bit longer. Because they know that their fathers love them and that their decisions are for the best of the family. Well, Christians, as they grow, Christian growth is growing in your trust in your father, growing to understand that if he loves you so much that he'd be willing to slay his son just to have you, then everything he allows in your life, good or bad, it's not punishment, it's for your good. Because if he would slay his son for you, what else would he do? In the same way that fathers love to hear from their children. Nothing gives me more joy when I'm in my office and I'm working on my computer, and then I hear Dot on the door and say, Dot, you know, like, you know, where's Dad? Nothing gives me more joy than you. And to have her on my lap when she's doing whatever she's doing and talking to me, nothing gives me more joy. The same way, do you think that there's anything that gives God more joy than when you talk to him? when you express your griefs and your worries and talk to him and wrestle with him, and then also to hold him to his promises, to read his word and see the things that he's promised you and say, God, you promised me this, do this. He loves it when you do that because it shows that you trust him and you trust his word. And in the same way that, as Jesus says, good fathers don't give bad things on purpose to their children. Right? If your son or daughter asks for a loaf of bread or a fish, and you can give them a rock or a snake, but you take that a little bit further. Sometimes children have a way of asking for things that are really bad for them. They think they really need it. They think it'd be really good, but it's actually really, really bad for them. And parents who know what they need before they even ask will actually lovingly say no. Do you think it's possible that maybe there have been things that you asked for throughout your life that now you look back and you realize, oh, okay, if God would have said yes to that, it would have really hurt me. I think about that move to Madison when I was a teenager. I was really disturbed by it. I was really angry about it because it seemed wrong. And now I look back and I realize if I hadn't moved to Madison, I wouldn't have made the friends that I have today. I wouldn't have met my wife. I probably wouldn't be a pastor because I wouldn't have been around the teachers that encouraged me to go into the ministry. My whole life would be different, probably for the worse. Is it possible that maybe there are things that God is withholding from you, that God is letting you experience, not because he hates you, but because he loves you? And in those times, remember that. If God, again, was willing to slay his own son just to have you, my goodness, what else would he give you? All of that is what you are confessing and celebrating when you say, Our Father. Amen.